Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder historian, and as Longstreet's divisions pushed into the Union rear, they began to lose cohesion as they grasped about, finding pockets of Union resistance. The success of the Confederates produced some confusion as they made it to Dyer Field. As Heineman dealt with Sheridan's division to the south, Longstreet's center division under Bushrod Johnson marched into Dyer Field, where 26 Union artillery pieces sat on the western edge of the field. Major John Mendenhall positioned these artillery pieces as directed by Major General Thomas Crittenden. The major gathered what cannons he could, as many of them were of no use in the dense woods that covered the battlefield. Two regiments, the 13th Michigan and 26th Ohio, neither of them numbering more than 100 men, assembled in the field to protect the artillery pieces. Confederate Major General John Bell Hood directed Johnson to capture the artillery pieces. When the Southerners exited the tree line, they came under a heavy bombardment from 26 artillery pieces. One of the shells wounded McNair, and Colonel David Coleman took command of the brigade. Battery E of the 9th Georgia Artillery Battalion unlimbered only one gun before the Union shells drove them back into the tree line. Perry's brigade had come up on Coleman's right flank to give support, but only contained 3 regiments. The 44th Alabama had departed the brigade near Poe Field, and the 15th Alabama was coming up behind Zachariah Dee's brigade and had accidentally delivered a volley of friendly fire into Dee's men. The Gray lines advanced across the field, with Coleman's brigade suffering extensive damage from the Union gunners. At one point, the entire brigade halted and sought cover along a fence line. Shug's brigade swung around the flank of the 8th Indiana Battery, which somewhat lightened the rounds of ammunition plunging into Coleman's troops. 13th Michigan and 26th Ohio miraculously held out for a good 15 minutes against the overwhelming numbers of Confederates before they and many of the batteries withdrew from the field. In all, 14 or over half of the artillery pieces assembled by Mendenhall had been captured. Fulton's brigade to the south routed not only Union troops but Rosecrans himself, who had his field headquarters directly in their path. With the enemy gone, the Confederate brigades lost cohesion. Coleman's brigade pulled back across Dyer Field. The rest of Johnson's brigades advanced across it, taking up a position on the high ground beyond. Perry's men were without direction and sat at the north end of the field. Benning's Georgians were falling back from their engagement with the Federal forces near Poe Field. Robertson's brigade was advancing north, trying to find someone to support them in an attack against the gathering Yankees in their front, and Kershaw and Humphrey's brigades, searching for an enemy to fight, swung north through the Dyer Field. Many of the Gray troops were low or out of ammunition. Some solved the problem by discovering abandoned ammunition wagons left by the retreating Federals, but the men were exhausted. To the north, Jerome Robertson's brigade of Texans and Arkansans were attempting to dislodge a pocket of Federal resistance. They advanced across the open field, coming under an incredible barrage of enemy cannon fire and musketry from a thrown-together group of blue soldiers. To add to their woes, Robertson's troops were hit by friendly fire as well on their left flank. Their brand-new uniforms, which looked more blue than gray, had gotten the attention of some of their fellow Southerners. What Robertson didn't know was that he was in a foot race. Union General Thomas Wood, whose division opened the hole through which Longstreet's men entered the Union lines, ordered Harker's men forward without delay and without waiting to dress ranks. The 125th Ohio reached the fence that bordered the north end of the field and quickly began tearing it down to create a crude breastwork to hide behind. Then the rest of Harker's regiments filed in alongside the 125th. The Texans got stubborn as they traded volleys with the Federal troops out in the open. Then Wood ordered the 64th and 125th Ohio to advance, which they did in a continuous wall of volleys as the men used the same tactics as August Willock had done the day before against Cheatham's division. The Texans and Arkansans melted away amidst the iron and lead. A sergeant in Robertson's command remembered Dyer Field as the meanest, most unsatisfactory place I struck during the whole war. Men were staggering and stumbling to the rear, covered in blood, some swearing and some calling on God to protect them in their blind endeavor to find shelter from the storm of iron hail. It made me feel like the world was coming to an end then and there. Confederate Major General John Bell Hood, acting commander of Longstreet's corps during this day at Chickamauga, since Longstreet commanded the entire left wing of the Confederate Army of Tennessee, had just ordered Kershaw's brigade to support Robertson when he saw his Texans and Arkansans streaming back into the tree line south of the field. Hood rode amongst his men that he had led into battle as a colonel when a bullet entered his upper right thigh, breaking his femur. He tumbled from his saddle into the arms of his Texans. Without Hood to help organize, the Confederate offensive lost even more cohesion in the coming hours. Meanwhile, Kershaw's men with Humphreys' brigade close behind advanced northward, joined by the 1st Arkansas Mounted Rifles, who had gotten lost from Coleman's brigade. Adding to Harker's woes was the removal of some of the artillery on his right and the 21st Ohio. Union Division Commander James Negley despaired over the Union's situation and began pulling out artillery and infantry that he could find and retreat toward Rossville. The 21st Ohio fell back to Horseshoe Ridge, and the Union forces gathered there by George Thomas. Thomas was riding back and forth across Kelly Field from his main line to Horseshoe Ridge and Snodgrass Hill. When he, Wood, and Harker saw Kershaw's men, they were puzzled about what to do. Their uniforms looked blue, and they didn't recognize the flags. They carried Army of Northern Virginia battle flags, not the Polk or Hardy Corps flags that the Army of the Cumberland was used to. Even after a volley by the strange troops, Thomas was uncertain. He thought it may be Sheridan's troops, who he had been expecting for the last hour. He instructed Harker to wave his flags as hard as possible to let the brigade know they were Federal forces. The new uniforms issued to Kershaw's men allowed the South Carolinians to advance within 100 yards of Harker's line and fire a volley. Now there was no mistaking, this was the enemy, and Harker's men fired back. The South Carolinians surrounded Harker's men. Kershaw's plan to overlap the Union position was working, and when confronted by the 2nd South Carolina and 3rd South Carolina Battalion on their right, the 58th Indiana and 100th Illinois broke first. This created a domino effect, with the 125th Ohio being the last to hold out, backing away slowly and making the Southerners fight for every inch of ground. The regiments would eventually reform near the Snodgrass cabin. The Union now had thousands of soldiers positioned on Horseshoe Ridge, assembled there by George Thomas, Thomas Wood, and others, as various regiments and brigades retreated to the northwest. Taking this high ground would be one of the most difficult endeavors by the Confederate forces under Longstreet's command during this battle.